go to overtime.
Series, tournament, major potential, worlds all on the line. You win this, you keep your hopes alive. Raise Bull calls game! Are you kidding?
El Toro comes through. Raise Bull. Who else? MVP.
And with that goal, Raise Bull qualified his team Complexity to the Spring Major. But for every story like Raise Bull's, there's the other side of the coin, the team that didn't make the major. Version 1 is one of those teams. They didn't know it yet, but that loss to Complexity eliminated them from major contention. There's a lot of stories like Version 1, and so today I'm going to take some time and go over the top 10 teams that didn't make the Spring Major. Now these are going to be teams across all regions in the order I think they are most competitive, going down from 10 all the way to 1. But we're going to start off with some honorable mentions. Now, I do want to point out the honorable mentions I'm going for are not the 11th and 12th team. I have 2 honorable mentions. They're not the next best. There are a few teams that would take those next few slots. I haven't picked them as honorable mentions. The reason why is there's a couple teams that are relevant to the scene and more specifically are going to the World Championship that could have made the major and I feel deserve a spot on this list. First up, most notably in my opinion, is Limitless. Now this team plays in Sub-Saharan Africa, so they are not eligible for any of the majors. If they could have qualified for the majors, they would have. They have gone on a tear in Sub-Saharan Africa. This split, they lost 1 series, just 1 across 3 regionals, and they won the entire thing. The 1 series they lost was a team called French Class, perhaps the only team in Sub-Saharan Africa that gave them a challenge this split, but even that loss was in Game 7. This team is just incredible. They've looked good all season. In fact, this team is made up of 2 players that used to be on Orlando Pirates last season that played at the World Championship, and their 3rd player to die for was on the Bravado squad that also did well at the World Championship. So all 3 of these players have been to an RLCS LAN, they've played at the World Championship, and they're going to be back this year as the number 1 seed out of Sub-Saharan Africa. And had Sub-Saharan Africa been given a spot in the majors, like other regions, for example, APAC has a spot, just 1, Limitless would have been that team out of Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, don't get me wrong, Sub-Saharan Africa is considered the weakest region in RLCS, and there is a reason for that. But at the same time, I believe all RLCS regions, that are called RLCS regions, should be given spots in the majors. And it's very disappointing that to this day, Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have a spot, despite going a full year without one. Now this is in their 2nd year with only spots in the World Championship. And yeah, if any Sub-Saharan Africa team was to get a win, it would be this Limitless squad. They are clearly the best. They were 2 of the best players. They picked up arguably the best player in the region to die for. He's incredible. And they're looking good. I don't know how they'll do at the World Championship. I don't know how they would have done at the Spring Major. But they are a good team. And under other circumstances, they easily could have made the major as the best team in their region. So for that reason, I listed them as an honorable mention. Now, the next team on my list, as an honorable mention I should say, is Gaming Gladiators out of APAC. This is the team that has given Elevate some trouble. Elevate qualified for the major, but Gaming Gladiators didn't. They lost to Elevate twice this split, although I should note that the last regional of the season, the Spring Invitational, Gaming Gladiators won. They beat Elevate in a close series. Specifically, they came in as the upper bracket team, and they lost the reset, so that means Elevate, in fact, won the sweep 4-0 to reset the bracket, but Gaming Gladiators didn't let the sweep get to their heads. They played tight the next series, they went all the way to Game 7, and they clutched it up. They won the series, they earned themselves that regional win, but it wasn't enough based on earlier performances to qualify for the major. And now, the reason they're not on my list in the top 10 is not only is APAC known to be a bit of a weaker region, but more importantly, Gaming Gladiators didn't have as good a split as their past split where they made the Winter Major. They lost to teams that they shouldn't be losing to, most notably Paradigm, I'm probably mispronouncing that, which is made up of Kevin, Beliers, I'm not going to remember the full roster, but I know Kevin, great player. That's not necessarily a bad team, but Gaming Gladiators haven't been the top of APAC this split. They also lost to Patriots, although Patriots have been putting up a fight, being Elevate as well. So they didn't have too many losses. Let me count this up. They had 5 losses this split. And they've looked still like the second best team in APAC, but just not quite as good as they were in Winter, and clearly behind Elevate. But that said, they did win a regional. They have looked fantastic, and they're going to be at the World Championship. So I thought they deserved an honorable mention on this list. Now, without further ado, I'm going to start talking about our top 10 teams. Now, as a reminder, this is the top 10 teams that are not attending this RLCS Spring Major. There's 16 teams at the Major, but there's quite a few good teams in the world that didn't get to attend. In fact, the World Championship has even more teams, so some of these teams on this list will be at the World Championship that didn't get to attend the Spring Major. Some of them are still up in the air. They don't know if they're going to make it or not. When I was trying to pick these teams, it's basically a power ranking of the teams that didn't get to make the major. So it's a direct case of who I think would be who, incorporating all the regions. And I'm going to be upfront. I found this task much harder than power ranking the teams at the major. Once you start to get into the weeds, it's really difficult to rate lower teams of regions across regions, because there are some teams that almost never attend LANs, but they're still performing consistently well in the region. How do you rank them against other region teams? So I did my best. There might be some spicier takes here than in my previous videos, because like I said, I think this is a difficult task, but this is my opinion. That's what I came up with. If there's a team that didn't make it and you're surprised, I probably consider them. I looked at all the regions, I looked at the standings, not only the spring rankings, but the overall standings. So I considered every team that would be, in Worlds or even had a chance at making Worlds when I was making this list. Or the Spring Major too, because there were some teams that formed only in the Spring Split. Alright, without further ado, let's get into it. So, first team I have here is W7M Esports. Now, some of you may not know who they are, but they're a South American team that's been near the top. They've been top 5 multiple splits in a row. This split, they got 5th. Yes, this is the 5th Sam's team, South American team in terms of spring split points, and yet they made my list. The reason why, this is a bit of a spoiler, I think they're better than the 4th place South American team, ERA. They had just a few points short, but they've had better performances. They've only lost to the top 3 teams in South America or ERA, and they traded series with ERA. They went away 1-1, they lost 1. They've went deep in tournaments, including a 2nd place in the Spring Cup in South America, and they've just looked really good. They're winning the matches they should be winning. They're only losing to those top teams, and they've beaten top teams. They've beaten Team Secret, they've beaten Crew. They lost to Ninjas in Pajamas in a Game 7 in the Spring Cup. They almost won a Grand Final. They almost won a regional in South America. And I think they're the 4th best team in South America. I think they're quite good in a quite difficult region. And so they made my list at top 10. Now, the next team on this list is one more people should be familiar with. It's PSG Tundra. I'm putting them at 9 on my list. PSG Tundra is coming off of a 7th place in Europe in the Spring Split, and they're standing 8th in the overall standings across the entire season. And although they're certainly not a bad team, they've kind of just been that middle-of-the-road top 8 team for quite a while now in Europe. This pretty much this season. It's an interesting one. I thought about trying to put them higher. I've loved this core of Ivan and Catalysm, who have been a duo together since RLCS X, all the way back at the Spring Split of RLCS X they've been doing. They used to be on their team name used to be German Amigos. This was the squad that got picked up by Evil Geniuses, though, later the next season. Eventually got dropped, and now they're back, got picked up again by PSG Tundra. They've always been good, and they've been top 8 for quite a while, like around that level. They've peaked higher, they've been to a major under Evil Geniuses, but this last split was not that. They haven't looked as good, and ultimately that's why they're on this list. They're good, but they're not good enough to break it a little bit higher. And they got 2 top 8s this past split. They're winning some good games. They beat G1, they swept them. They beat Sa, but they're also losing. They've lost a Guild, they've lost Oxygen, they've lost as well, I believe, to Sa, yeah. So traded with Sa, they're losing to teams around them. And they haven't won any big games. They're losing to when they play BDS, the Carmine Corp, the Moist, they're losing those games. Sometimes close. I mean, they lost in a Game 5 to Moist to end their season in the Spring Invitational. Which, speaking of ending the season, this team is not in contention for Worlds. So they are done for this season. And they're definitely good. Like I think they're clearly one of the top 10 teams that didn't make the Major, as I have them here at 9. But I couldn't put them much higher because they just haven't really shown a lot of spark this season. And unfortunately, they're out. But yep, good on them to have a solid season in Europe, and we'll see what they do in the off season, if they make any roster moves or anything. All right, next on my list, a team with quite a few more hopes is Team Falcons. Now, they didn't make the major, and they probably had the worst split they've ever had in Middle East, but this is still the same Team Falcons. It's still Ahmad, it's still Khaled, it's still Turk, and they can win. And they've gotten all the way to a grand finals in RLCS Major before. That didn't happen this time. They didn't even make the major, but they will be at Worlds in the wild card, and I think they could do quite well there. We'll see how it goes. I have them only on 8 on this list, though, because that's it. They really did not have a good split. They're trading wins with Twisted Minds. Not a bad team. Senzo's a great player, former, I don't know if he was Falcons, but former Sandrock Gaming player, Senzo. But trading wins, series wins, I should say, not game wins. Trading wins with Twisted Minds is not where Falcons used to be. They're playing third fiddle. They got third in the split. Now, I'll be a slight spoiler reveal for this list. I do have them above Twisted Minds, but the fact that they're trading series away is not a good sign. And they're losing to Rule 1 when it matters. They did win one regional, but they lost the other two. And they've just looked a step behind this split, besides that one regional win. So for that reason, I have them here at 8, even though at other times they might have been higher, but at other times they would have made the major. So it's pretty much where Falcons is at. And at 7, the next team on my list, I have Team Secret, another South American team. Now, this is a bit lower than I thought I would put Secret when I started compiling this list, but looking at their results, I really just couldn't place them any higher. Although they're taking care of business against some of the lower end teams in South America, they're losing the series that really matter. They lost 3 times the split to Crew, who, don't get me wrong, are an incredible team, and 2 of those losses were in Game 7. But they haven't beat them a single time. They also lost their only match against Ninjas in Pajamas, again in a Game 7. But then they also lost to W7M, the team I had previous on this list, and the only time they played them. And out of all the teams in South America that I've spoken about, they were the only team to lose to like a non-top 5 team. They lost to Ruby. And although that was a Game 5, it's just a disappointing look in the last regional of the season for Secret, and it led to them forcing them to face Crew earlier than they otherwise would have, which led to them missing the major. And they potentially could miss Worlds if South America doesn't do good at the major. I don't expect that to happen. Team Secret is likely to make Worlds, but now they're sitting and waiting, watching other people play to get them a spot at the World Championship. Not a position I would have foreseen from a Secret team, a core anyway, that got top 4 previously. I mean, we're talking about KV1 Knight. They're looking good. But yeah, I still have them here at 7 because they are a great team. And they have beaten, like I said, all those teams below them, including ERA, a team I previously mentioned, top 5, beating them multiple times. And they are taking care of business against those lower end teams. But it's not a good, was not a good split for them, even in a tough region like South America. Now, the next team on my list is desperately hoping that 4 European teams do very well at the major, because their only chance of making Worlds is if that happens. I'm talking about G1. They're sitting at 7th in the European standings, and so they need 4 teams in Europe to make the main event to open up more spots in the wild card for European teams. And it's pretty unlikely that happens. It's definitely possible. In fact, I have power rated European teams quite strong, and it's certainly possible that it'll work out that way. But based on, the way majors usually go, the law of averages, the fact that European teams can knock out other European teams, it makes G1's odds of making the World Championship pretty unlikely. We'll see how it goes, though. And I do have them here at 6 on my list, despite a pretty poor overall standing and even worse spring split standing. They got 10th in the spring split in Europe. But 10th can be a little misleading because all the teams from 7th to 11th were only 5 points apart, and it was really incredibly close. And although PSG Tundra did beat G1 in a head-to-head in the Spring Open, G1 had an upward trajectory across the split, ending their season with a top 8. And I think that after they made the roster move where they dropped Mark by 8 and picked up Oli, it took them a little time to gel, but they're starting to really get it together. And I think that although they may not do well at Worlds, I think they would do better than they did in the European split, in the spring split, because they've gotten that time to kind of warm up and play well together. That said, they still are 6 on my list near the bottom half of this power rankings because they didn't have a good split. And although they got better, they're still not as good as some other teams out there. So that brings us to bottom half of our list being complete. We're now moving on to the top 5. These are the 5 best teams that didn't make the major. We're now getting to the point where these are teams that, if they had made the major, I think they might have done well. It's some of these cases, they were shocking upsets that they didn't make the major. Other cases, a little more shocking upset that they're even on this list. But without further ado, let's get to that top 5. So in 5th, I have Oxygen. Now, a lot of people know Oxygen and expected them to do better in the spring split, but kind of in a similar story to G1, they didn't do too hot. They got 23 points, putting them tied for 8th place behind PSG Tundra, although slightly ahead of G1. And in the overall standings, they're doing better than G1. They're sitting in 5th, a lot more likely to make Worlds, but still not locked in. BDS could pass them, EU could lose some spots, and they could miss Worlds. That said, I'd put them more on the likely category to make Worlds, much better chances than G1. They are still sitting at home and waiting though. They're not at the major. I have them 5 at my list because although they had a poor spring split, similar to G1, they had better. They just had better head-to-head matches. Although they did lose head-to-head to G1 to end their spring invitational, I should say. I think the roster is just more talented. Although that is like a paper roster thing to say, they are more talented. I think that they're going to be hungry more coming into the World Championship. They're going to put it together. Jurias, Archie are both known for their low hours, so when they lose like this, they tend to get a little more motivated, put in a little bit more hours, which can make a drastic difference. And Ixo's been an amazing player for a while now. Perhaps a little bit too much faith. I'd say this one's one of the more into belief territory, maybe along with G1. But I think they're playing in a tough region, and a lot of their losses were to the top teams. They've lost to BDS this split, they lost to Moist. They had some losses they shouldn't have taken, though. They did lose to Luna Galaxy in the last regional, although that is a good squad. All in all, they are a solid team, but they're only as high as 5 on my list because they had a poor spring split. This roster could have done better, and if they go to the World Championship, I hope they do better because these are some great players. Archie used to be on my favorite team Endpoint, although he was a replacement for Seiko, one of the best players still to this day, but at the time especially. That said, though, I do think this squad could do well, and I have them here at 5 because I think they could have made the major if things had gone other ways, if they had just performed better as a squad. Alright, now we're moving on to top 4. At 4th, I have G2 Esports. Now this is a North American team that had a somewhat disappointing split, but to be fair, it was a very stacked split. There were a lot of teams that could have made the major, and going into the 3rd regional, I think there were 10 teams that controlled their own fate. Quite wild, quite wild. So G2 is definitely sitting more pretty than some of the other teams I've talked about in terms of making Worlds, because although they're not locked, they're coming in at 4th place. And although Space Station is likely to pass them, being in that top 5 in NA makes it very likely, in terms of overall standings I should say, makes it very likely that they make Worlds. On the other hand, their spring split was pretty poor. They got 8th place. It was a tough region. They had some tough tournaments. They had some tough regionals. But ultimately, they didn't make the cut. They didn't make the top 5. I have them here at 4 though because they're playing quite well against major teams. Now, their most notable loss, I should point out, is in the first regional of the spring split. They lost to SUP. Not a bad team by any means, but not a team G2 should be losing to if they want to be doing well at international lands. And losing to SUP put them in a tough match very early on against FaZe, and although they did beat FaZe, which is a big deal, they later lost to Optic, a recurring trend, as they lost to Optic in every single regional once. They've also lost to Furia, Space Station. It's just generally been a tough time for them. And yeah, that's kind of been their split. They didn't beat a single major team besides Gen G. And so although they're on my list, they're the lowest North American team I'm just going to talk about because they just clearly were behind the others. So now we're going to be moving on to the top 3. I have to say these were some of the hardest decisions in the entire list. Uh, I these top 3 teams I feel it could have easily been in a different order, but this is the order I've decided to put them in just based on my personal feelings of how these series would go if they played each other in a LAN environment. First up is third place, and in third place I have version 1 esports. Now people might think they should be higher. They did win a regional in North America, but ultimately they lost when it mattered most in both their first and their third regional. Losing to some major teams, yes, but also to a Game 5 to Team Koi, a team that they really shouldn't be losing to if they wanted to be higher on a list like this. If they wanted to be one of the best teams not pending Spring Major, they should be losing to only major teams, and unfortunate for them that didn't happen. They lost to Koi, and it set up a horribly difficult match for them in complexity in the lower bracket, and losing that ended up eliminating them from major contention, as I alluded to earlier in the video. They are still quite good, don't get me wrong. They have a lot of win against major teams. They have wins against FaZe that didn't make the major as well. They've traded games with complexity even. Traded with Space Station. They've lost multiple times to Furia, unanswered though. And ultimately it was kind of just like a wild split. It's wild that they could do so well in one regional, which is where a lot of those wins came from. Regional 2, the Spring Cup. And yet lose a lot of these other series, including getting swept by Complexity, getting swept by Furia in the first regional, losing 3-1 to Complexity in their last regional, and that Game 5, like I said, Koi. It's been an up and down split for them. Everyone knows Beast Mode and Daniel are some of the best in North America, and Calm's an amazing teammate. So it's kind of just inexplicable how they did this poorly, but that's why sometimes on paper it doesn't mean the best. They even have a good coach, notable Fireburner, notable is being an incredible coach. A lot of people are shocked by what happened in this split, and me too. But that's why I have them at third and not higher. Not lower though, because again, they did win a regional. They've looked great in region, but I don't think they have what it takes to do super well on LAN. Not the way they're looking right now. So can't put them much higher than third. But now moving right along, we have Hogan Mode. Now, this is probably a lot higher than people had expected, and it might be surprising to have them so high, higher than all other European teams, higher than version 1. But I think Hogan Mode's had an amazing split. Despite missing the second regional, they were challenging to make the major. And yes, they ultimately lost well before they would have played a tiebreaker against Moist. But the fact that they were that close to a tiebreaker against Moist, if they had won 3 more series, if they'd beaten 2 more teams, they could have made the major. It was very, well, whether or not they could have beat Vitality, it's another story. But they had a very real chance of making the grand final in their last regional. They've beaten Carmine Corp, they've beaten Liquid, they've beaten major teams. And they haven't lost, besides from their close qualifier in Regional 2, they haven't lost to not top teams. They've lost to Moist twice, once to Carmine Corp and once to BDS. Meaning that again, besides that strange blip in the second regional close qualifier, they have looked like they are clearly that 6th best team. Now Moist is better, Moist beat them twice, but I think if you had to pick a 6th in Europe, and if you look at the standings and who's at 6th, it's clearly Hogan Mode. They would have had a real shot at making the major if only they had played in the second regional, which is the craziest part of all of this, that they didn't make the second regional, yet they're still this high on my list. But with Scrubkilla's experience, with kind of just the team peaking, I think they'd have a decent shot playing in international matches if they were to play in a LAN. Now, unfortunately for any Hogan Mode fans out there, because they just formed in the spring split, and because they didn't make the spring major, there is no chance they'll attend Worlds, so they are done for this season. But they did look like an incredible team, and I genuinely believe that Hogan Mode that we saw in the third regional could win international matches on LAN. That's why I have them so high. Higher than version 1. I think that they were clutching up when it mattered, although again, they did have a wild... It's like an inverse of version 1 split, where they had one incredibly poor regional instead of one incredibly good regional and 2 poor ones. And at both Regional 2 were where that happened. Hogan Mode missed the Regional 2 entirely, version 1 won it. But in 1 and 3, Hogan Mode did great, version 1 not so much. like I said before, though, I think these top 3 teams could be interchangeable. I wouldn't be opposed if you told me you think version 1 should be number 1, number 2, Hogan Mode 3. But I think I'd put them 2. I think I'd have them over version 1, but behind our number 1 team. And that number 1 team is, and if you've been paying any attention to North America, Europe, the top regions in general, you probably know who's coming. It's FaZe Clan. Now, this FaZe Clan roster has looked quite good at times, but then at other times they've just had some inexplicable losses. But I think it's to no surprise that they are number 1 on this list because they were the only team that had to play in a tiebreaker and could have made the major off of a tiebreaker. And I will say, although FaZe did lose that tiebreaker to Gen G, I feel like under other circumstances they would have won it. And what I mean by that is they had to have their mental just completely shattered when they got reverse swept by Optic. I don't think they were playing their best against Gen G, which is not to discredit Gen G, who deserved to be at the major. FaZe don't. They lost fair and square. But I think it's also fair to say that FaZe aren't just that good team on paper. They could have made the major. There were some coin flip series they lost. And were they to make another major, I think they'd still be a threat to make another deep run. They just got second at the winter major. They could make another deep run again. And so let's talk a little more about that split. They have lost to non-major teams. They lost to G2, although G2 is also on this list, and they did lose to version 1, another team on this list. Other than that, they've lost mostly to Furia, Space Station, the Optic and Gen G matches I already mentioned. So losing to good teams, they're also beating good teams. They've beaten Space Station, they've beaten Optic, they've well, those were their best wins now that I'm looking back at it. But they've also beaten Shopify Rebellion. They've been a good team this split, but they've lost some of the just clutch series where they had to win. That reverse sweep where they lost Optic could have clinched them a spot in the major. They were really close, but they didn't make it. I think they're still really good. That's why I have them number 1. Like I said, I think their mental was gone by the end of that Optic series, and that kind of affected them in the follow-up in the Gen G series. And they have already qualified for Worlds. They are sitting at second currently in the North American standings, and although they could fall, they very well could make main event based on the backs of what other North American teams do at the major. I wouldn't be surprised. They could have automatic into that top 16 at Worlds. They've looked really good all season. This was their poorest split by a pretty wide margin. And like I alluded to, they got 6th because of that tiebreaker. So they were tied for 5th, and they just ended up losing the tiebreaker series. It's a disappointment by FaZe Clan standards, but certainly not a bad team at all. And I do think that Miss Typical First Killer will come back in the World Championship even stronger because of this. First Killer at sometimes have been argued to be the best player in the world. I don't think he's the best player in the world right now, but certainly not right now. But he can be on the day, and if they perform, if they peak on LAN at upcoming Worlds, they could do very well. So we'll see how it goes with FaZe Clan, but I think they are pretty clearly the best team that did make the major. This was a tough, now that we're kind of through, I'll throw up the list, the full list. And I've got to say, this was much harder to put together than my previous lists. I think there's, like I said, there's a lot of teams that haven't been in international lands. It's hard to put them where they are. There's a lot of depth to Europe and North America, and it's hard to see how that compares to the other regions. I try to give deeper North American and European teams a fair leg to stand on, but I also I rate some MENA teams, some South American teams. I wanted to show that as well. Europe I found particularly hard to judge because it was so dominant from those top 4 and Moist as well as top 5 teams that the other teams just didn't have a lot of points to go around, so they were kind of all around the same standings. I could have easily thrown some other teams in. I won't go through naming every team that could have made it, but I know Team Guild had a good shot at making the list. I thought about putting them in. Another team, Team Falcons, traded wins with Twisted Minds. I thought about putting Twisted Minds on the list. I think there were quite a few good teams that didn't make the major. Not even these 10. There could be more that I would qualify as good Rocket League. That's subjective, but my point being there's a lot of good teams, and so it was difficult to rate them, especially since they won't be playing, so we won't really get to see how. Like, there's no way really to verify this list, unlike my previous ones, where we'll see what happens. But I think I'll stand by it. A lot of these teams will play in Worlds, though, which will be interesting to see. I think some of my spiciest takes on this list had to be Hogan mode at 2. A lot of people put them lower because it was just one split. It was only 2 regionals. But, man, if they can beat Karmine Corp, they can beat pretty much anybody. So, that's why I had them so high, really, is that Karmine Corp win, that Liquid win. It's a bit of a meme, everyone was memeing when they were making it far, but, I mean, that's another thing. They have fans behind them. And the fans are behind them because they're not just putting on a show, it's because they were playing well. And I think I genuinely would put them there. Like I said before, though, you know, version 1 them is a flip-flop, but that's where I'd put them. Other than that, like solid list. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and me explaining the list. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, a subscribe. Everything helps out the channel. Comments, whether you disagree with the list, what you liked the most, what you disliked. Yeah, and I hope you genuinely enjoyed. I tried to be a fair builder of this list, but there's always some bias that leaks in, so don't get too upset at me if your favorite team didn't make it or you felt they should have been higher. Leave a description as why. I read through the comments, and I genuinely love to see what you guys think. I think that a lot of this does delve into opinion, a little bit subjective, so I'd love to hear your opinions down in the comments, who you think would be the best team that didn't make their major. Alright, with that, I'll end the video here, so thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.